Hi everybody, nice to see you again. Welcome back to the channel. This is going to be the first video in another short series about pronunciation. Basically, there are going to be 4 videos in this series, 3 of which will be focusing on Japanese pronunciation, what's important, what's not, what you should focus on, what you shouldn't worry so much about. But the first video, which is to say this video, is going to be focusing on something a little bit different. There's a certain misconception that is quite popular amongst second language learners, foreign language learners, and that's what I want to address in this video. Basically, you'll find people on YouTube and undoubtedly in other places as well saying something along the lines of the following. When it comes to learning to pronounce foreign languages, you just have to be good enough to be understood. As long as people can understand what you're saying, any progress you might make beyond that point is fundamentally not very important. It's not of any great significance. As long as you're understood, that's all that's important. People who say stuff like this usually, to be blunt, don't have very good pronunciation. Be that as it may, what I want to do here is examine this idea and see exactly what's wrong with it, because there is something very wrong with it. So we're going to be examining this issue here in quite some detail, as a matter of fact, but the main problem is basically that there is no magical line in the sand that you can cross to guarantee that you will always be understood in a foreign language. What I'm saying is that there is no level of pronunciation beyond which your pronunciation will not cause you problems anymore. That magical line in the sand actually doesn't exist. So let's have a think about why not. In total here we'll be looking at 4 reasons why this magic line in the sand doesn't exist. There are probably more, but these are the 4 most important in my opinion. Reason number 1 is that different people just have different levels of exposure to non-natives speaking their language. Understanding some non-native version of your own language is a skill, and different people have developed that skill to different extents. Let me give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. For reasons known only to themselves, many Russian speakers like to pronounce the English word her as hyor. Now, that is quite a bad mispronunciation in various ways, but it's quite common with Russians. I don't really know what their problem is, but they do it quite a lot. The first time I ever heard this, I for a second had absolutely no idea what I was hearing. Hyor? I just didn't understand. But of course, over time, because I spent a lot of time working with Russians, I got used to it. Now, when I hear hyor, I immediately know what it is. I try to help people with it. I try to correct them. I try to help them develop an understanding of what's wrong with this. But in terms of comprehension, yeah, I understand it immediately because I've heard it 1,000 times and I know exactly what they're saying. That's a skill, right? That's practice. I remember giving an English lesson once to an Israeli guy. And his English wasn't too bad. He had quite a strong Israeli accent, but he was speaking pretty well. Nonetheless, he told me about problems that he was having in London, problems being understood when he spoke to people. On the streets, in shops, just as part of his everyday life, he was noticing that people couldn't understand him particularly well, at least not all the time. I didn't have any problems understanding him, but I've spent so much time listening to non-native speaking English that to me it's second nature now. Just because your Japanese girlfriend can understand your weird Japanese pronunciation, assuming you have a Japanese girlfriend and weird pronunciation, that doesn't mean that anybody else is going to be able to understand it. The people who spend a lot of time with you are used to your peculiar pronunciation. Normal Japanese people aren't. People are very different in this regard. Bad pronunciation will be understood pretty well by some people. Quite good pronunciation will still be misunderstood by other people if those people don't have much experience speaking to foreigners. Point number 2 is that predictable language is always much easier to understand than unpredictable language. I once did an English pronunciation lesson with a French guy. And basically this guy's problem, and this is how he put it to me, is that he had a very thick French accent and certain English sounds gave him a lot of problems. When he was speaking about his life, his family, his job, I didn't have any difficulty understanding him. But then, and this is something that he suggested, he started reading to me from a kid's book that he would read in English to his daughter. And suddenly, of course, I had absolutely no idea what he was going to say or what he was talking about. I'm going to say something to you now in English, and I want you to tell me, or put it in the comments if you like, whether or not you can understand it. Penelope the purple peacock walked across the gangplank. Now, some of you may have actually managed to figure out what that was. It was actually this. Penelope the purple peacock walked across the gangplank. Now when I say it, you can understand it, despite the fact that it's radically unpredictable. There's no way on earth you could have known that I was going to say that, right? But this book that he used to read his daughter had sentences like that in it. And it was an amazing experience because I suddenly realized that I couldn't understand what the hell he was saying. Because the text of the book was so unpredictable to me, suddenly it was like he was speaking a different language. When you're saying things that are predictable, people will be able to hear through your errors of pronunciation. But as soon as you start using more unpredictable language or more complex language, or both, and complex language usually will be relatively unpredictable, then you're going to run into difficulty because people's brains are no longer capable of predicting more or less what kinds of words you're going to use. A classic example would be Chinese tones. If you say hello in Chinese, the standard way of saying hello is to say ni hao. Now that's a second tone and a third tone. If you say ni hao, then people will still understand you because what else are you going to be saying? Right? When you meet someone on the street or wherever. But if you speak Chinese and actually garble your tones like that all the time, then the Chinese are not going to understand what you're talking about. So you can get away with mistakes in predictable language that you can't get away with when you're drawing on a much wider variety of the various linguistic resources that exist in the language, right? Point number 3 is that an isolated error may still be comprehensible, but when you get multiple overlapping errors in what you say or in what somebody else says, then it's highly unlikely that you will be understood. Now you can make more than one error of pronunciation in the same utterance, but you have to bear in mind that grammatical errors and lexical errors are also going to come into play here. If your grammar is poor and your lexical choices, i.e. your word use, if you like, is also poor, then your poor pronunciation may well end up being the final straw in somebody's attempts to understand you. Think of the following sentence for me. What a beautiful necklace. Look at how fine the carving is on the beads. Did you understand that okay? Well, I hope so. Now what about this one? What a beautiful necklace. Look at how fine the carving is on the beats. Now there, obviously, I said beats instead of beads. But because I'm the person who created that sentence with my native level grammar and my native level lexical choices, it probably just took you an extra second or two to figure out that I was saying beats instead of beads. By which I mean I was pronouncing it as beats despite the fact that it should have been beads, right? But let's say someone's English is very rudimentary, and instead of saying the initial sentence, they say this. Necklace very pretty, beads very good. Now, you might have some difficulty understanding that kind of English if you're not expecting it, but if you concentrate for a second, it should be comprehensible, because the way I pronounced the word beads was essentially more or less correct. Maybe the vowel was a little bit unusual, but it was essentially correct. But what if I say this? Necklace very pretty, beats very good. If you just hear that mispronunciation as being beats very good, you're probably going to think, It beats very good? What do you mean it beats very good? If something beats very well, you're almost certainly not going to understand what that means. The mispronunciation was the same in both cases, but when the sentence was well constructed, your brain could still figure out that I was trying to say beads. When the sentence was badly constructed, your brain wouldn't have been able to do that. It's highly unlikely that you would have understood that. In this example, of course, you already knew because I'd already told you. But in real life, you almost certainly would not have understood that. The comprehensibility of what we say is actually a very complex phenomenon. Grammar, lexical choices, pronunciation, all of these things are coming into play and interacting with each other at the same time. As you study the foreign language that you're studying, your grammar and your understanding of the lexicon should, of course, get better and better over time. But given that we're only human, we can't realistically expect to reach a point where we don't have any problems with the grammar or the lexicon of the language that we're studying. In addition to that, no matter how good you get at the foreign language you're studying, there will be times when you're not quite sure how to phrase things, when you're not quite sure how some piece of grammar works, or when you can't remember it in real time. There'll be times when you're not quite sure which word to use, which noun to use, which verb to use. When that happens, having accurate pronunciation gives the person you're talking to the best possible chance of understanding you. If you struggle to form your sentence correctly for whatever reason, and you have some sort of error of pronunciation in it, then you cannot expect to be understood. So good pronunciation is a kind of insurance that you can take out. It provides a certain possibility of you being understood, even when you're making mistakes in other regards in the language. That's important. If people can identify the individual words you're using, then they might be able to understand you despite your bad grammar. If you have bad grammar and bad pronunciation, then there's no way, is there? Point number 4 is that, to be blunt, there are people who are not interested in you and who do not attach any particular value to the communication that they engage in with you. To be blunt, not everybody gives a toss about you or your Japanese. Understanding your own language when it's being badly pronounced by a non-native takes a certain amount of work, it takes a certain amount of concentration. People who want to interact with you will be prepared on the whole to put in that mental work. But there are lots of people who don't give a toss. With people like that, you've really got to pronounce things well. Often when you're speaking your own language to a non-native, they'll say something and you won't understand it immediately. But a second or two later, something will go ping in your brain and you'll think, oh, that's what they were saying, I've got it. That can happen, it happens all the time. But for it to happen, the person actually has to be interested in communicating with you. They have to allow their brain to go to work on it. I heard a story once. I spent a bit of time in Colombia and I knew a little bit a British guy who lived there and who'd been living there for quite a long time. His Spanish was quite good, better than mine, but he had a very, very thick London accent. You could tell from like 2 miles away that he was from London when you heard him speak Spanish. He told me a story one night about having gone into a bar with his wife and he tried to order a couple of drinks and in some fashion he stumbled over what he said. He tripped up a bit over his own words when he tried to ask for a couple of beers or whatever it may have been. The Colombian girl behind the bar said to him in Spanish, oh, I'm sorry, I don't speak English, I'll go and get someone who speaks English. And she ran off. She didn't actually register that he was speaking Spanish to her. Her response was basically, oh, this guy's speaking English, I better go and get somebody else. There are people who do not care about you. There are people who are not interested in what you have to say. There are people who feel very, very awkward and embarrassed when they have to speak to somebody who doesn't speak their language natively. You're not going to get a second chance with people like that. If anything's a bit off, they think you're speaking English. And I can assure you, I've never been in this situation, I don't think. I don't think I've ever said anything to anybody in any foreign language that I speak and had them think that I was speaking English. But this guy in Colombia, this British guy, you could see how humiliating, how frustrating this had been. That he'd been in the country for something like 5 years speaking Spanish, and that sometimes when he spoke Spanish, people didn't even realize that he was indeed speaking Spanish. A cruddy feeling. Every time the pronunciation, which is to say your pronunciation of your target language improves, 4 things happen. You make it more likely that you'll be understood by people who aren't used to non-native pronunciation. You make it more likely that you'll be understood when you're using complex and unpredictable language. You make it more likely that you'll be understood when you make some sort of grammatical or lexical error. And last but not least, you make it more likely that people will be capable of communicating with you and willing to communicate with you, even when they're not that interested in you. You can tell yourself if you want that you're not interested in talking to people with those sorts of attitudes towards foreigners. Well, that's all well and good, but you don't always get to choose who you have to talk to and who you don't have to talk to. If you go and live in Japan one day, there'll be a lot of people you have to interact with and you're not going to have any choice in the matter. If you go into a bank and you have to talk to somebody in the bank, then you have to talk to whoever they dish out. And the chances are that that person's not really going to be very interested in you. But you've got to deal with that kind of situation anyway. Good luck doing that if your pronunciation is bad. So for all these reasons and perhaps other reasons that I haven't mentioned in this video, you've got to abandon this idea that once you reach a certain point, then you can forget about your pronunciation, because at least you're comprehensible now. There's no such thing as being comprehensible. It's much more complex than that. And this is before we even talk about the other benefits of having good pronunciation. But that's something that we can talk about in other videos. For the time being, remember, every time you can improve your pronunciation, you're doing something that's good and useful and important. If you still think that you can improve, you should try and improve. You should never tell yourself, I'm good enough now. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks very much for listening. In the other 3 videos in this series, we'll be looking at Japanese pronunciation specifically, so I hope you'll come back for those. Thanks very much. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.